So let me tell you a little bit about my brain. I don't understand how it works. Stupid bloody thing. How on earth can any of us understand what to do about something as scintillatingly vast as climate change if we can't even work out what we want for breakfast? This is Your Brain on Climate, a new podcast about psychology and what it can teach us about the climate crisis, what it is, how we got here, and what to do about it. My name's Dave. I've campaigned, talked and written about climate change for years and years, and I've always wondered, climate change is about all sorts of things, and psychology is just a part of that, but in large part it's the result of billions and billions of brains doing stuff. And human brains are very interesting, strange and squishy things, are they not? So maybe there are things we can learn from what we think and why we think it, which might help us come up with new ways of understanding and talking about climate change. I'm not a psychologist. You're probably not one either. What we're going to do is learn from some chats with some clever people about how our brains understand some really essential things like risk, conflict, love, hate, ignorance, hope, and how all of these things are part of the climate crisis. So joining me for this pilot episode of Your Brain on Climate is the redoubtable and very tolerant Adam Corner. Adam was until recently the Director of Policy and Research at Climate Outreach. He's now an independent writer and researcher, specialising in climate comms and culture climate collaborations. Most relevantly for our chat today, he's got a PhD in psychology, particularly looking at the thing we're going to look at today, which is risk. So how do our brains understand risk? What scares us? What can we learn from the last 18 months, life under the pandemic? And is climate change like that? And if it isn't, spoiler, kind of isn't, how do you actually get people to behave as if there was a climate emergency going on? Now we're going to try to keep this chat unjargony because this ain't school, but there are going to be times when someone may say something that makes you think, I wonder what that thing is that they just said. So when you hear this noise, it means I've put something in the show notes that you can click for more information. So this noise tells you, don't worry about the thing you've just heard. Roll with it for now and then go and look at the show notes if you want to find out more. This is the first episode of Your Brain on Climate. I'm really excited for you to be listening to it. It's going to go out on its own, but normally what we're going to do is a series of 6 episodes or so, and what I hope is the first one of those will follow later in the year. So let me know what you think of this first episode. You can find me on Twitter at BrainClimate or hello@yourbrainonclimate.com. So to start with, I thought I'd test Adam's patience from the off by demonstrating a very, very tenuous grasp on basic biology. Right, so risk. Okay, good. Now, we are basically lizards, right? When it comes to understanding risk. By which I mean, if I'm asleep somewhere and someone comes up to me and wakes me up, I don't immediately go, oh, hang on, what's happening here? There's something I need to consider. I go, Jesus! And I jump 6 feet into the air and I run away. Right? Or if I'm walking through a scary place late at night, I'm thinking something is going to bite me, right? And that's essentially what a lizard would do. We've still got, in terms of working out what is scary, that is still basically how we work, yes?
That is an interesting way of thinking about risk. I would say that
it's bollocks.
Yeah. There are some circumstances where there is a direct relationship. You've come up with some exciting scenarios there about lizards in alleyways. But, the one that I always kind of think of is like, okay, your house is on fire. You know, you're in your house.
Is it?
Your house that's on fire. Yeah, like, yeah. Don't look behind you now. And you know, in that sense, there are circumstances where you know, risk is fairly unmediated. It's fairly kind of, you know, unconstructed, non-constructed. I've thought a lot about this over the last year, and it's really kind of played on my mind a lot how constructed most risks are, which is not the same thing as saying they're made up. They exist, they're real, but they're so rarely ever unmediated. They almost always come through a great big pipeline or cluster or ecosystem of influences. And I think you can see it, you know.
So when you're saying unmediated, you mean like it's not, something is not just black or white, scary or not scary. We are telling ourselves in loads of different ways that it's more or less scary than it might be. We're getting in the way of that kind of lizard scary reaction with our clever human brains, right?
Not many risks are like that, I guess. You know, not many risks are like the being kind of like spooked and woken up from your sleep. I think most risks are told to us in one way or another, or are amplified or are kind of attenuated by the influences around us. And I mean, this is not, I don't want to suggest this is some grand insight that has occurred to me and only me in the last year. Like there's a lot of work on this, on like risk perceptions, frameworks for understanding how people construct and amplify risks. That, I mean, they're almost part of the furniture, kind of academically. You know, that it's just kind of standard. There's like social amplification of risk framework that sort of, you know, does exactly this. It pieces together all the different things that might influence your risk judgments, what you read or hear in the media, what your friends say, your limited attention span, you know, and it kind of says, well, all of these things work together to draw your attention and your emotions to a risk or not. But it's really been writ large.
So like going plane crashes, there's one, right? Like in our society and in general, loads of people are terrified of flying, right? And it's not like you will never die in a plane, but the same people who are terrified of flying think absolutely nothing of, for example, driving down the M4 at 70 miles an hour, which is just a much riskier thing to do. But we don't have that sort of construction of that risk. And because like if a plane crashes, it's on the news and everyone dies and it's really messy, that sort of captures the impression that we have of it. Is that what you mean? This unmediated risk thing? Yeah,
totally that. I mean, so there's this idea of like a kind of like a dread risk, which is a sort of like a low probability but high damage event, like a plane crash where lots of people are killed all at once. And it obviously is. This is the distinction. You know, it's not when you say that a risk is constructed. The plane did crash and those people did die. So there is something at the core of that is, you know, the event, the risk in a sense, but then layered on top of that is any number of kind of directions and interpretations of what do we do with that information. And there's this, a calculation was done in the aftermath of 9/11 where people stopped flying and in large numbers because they were scared of flying in the wake of 9/11. And that the calculation suggested that the same or more people were killed on US roads in the wake of 9/11 through choosing driving over flying and it's less safe, as you say, which I don't take to be a kind of idiots, why don't you jump in the plane? But it says something important, doesn't it? It tells you something important about what's doing the work in terms of like, you know, creating the reaction, the behavioral change. Is it the thing?
It's emotional.
Yeah.
It's emotional. It feels like we're having this really strong emotional kind of thing going on, right? And like, can we just talk for a second about what it is in the brain, what the difference is? So like, tell me about, I did some reading, thought I better had in preference to this, right? So the amygdala is the bit of the brain that we are left with from when we were lizards, right? So it is that kind of, were we ever lizards? Anyway, you know what I mean? The very, very, very old bit of the brain. And that's the bit that goes, shit, something bad is happening. I must run away, fight it, shag it, whatever. right? And then we've got all the new human stuff in the neocortex. Is that right? The kind of new humany, or is it mammalian? Anyway, the bit that basically goes, right, I'm going to think about what's happening. I'm going to think about what scary is. I'm going to make plans. And kind of there's a bit of a dance always happening. And it's that is the thing that is at work. Sometimes you have the emotions that you want to run away and fight, but other times your brain is going, no, it's all right, calm down. And is that what's happening, or am I just confusing myself and listeners and you and everyone?
And this part of this section of the conversation is called two men grope around in the dark to explain biology. I mean, I think that all sounds right to me, Dave. No, I think the amygdala is their kind of emotional bit for sure, and is an older part of the brain, and I think you see it in the way that people talk about system 1 and system 2 sort of thinking, and how do you trigger more kind of like conscious processing of information, moving away from those fight or flight instinctive evolutionary ancient monkey lizard responses, and I guess the point where I'm interested in that, or where it really seems to matter, is I guess there's a huge amount of neuropsychology that can tell you which parts of the brain lights up at different points when people are doing things, or can kind of correlate brain activity with certain reactions, and that all tells you something useful. But I think in a sense what's more kind of socially, politically critical is to understand how and why do some things seem to trigger that reaction, or one of those reactions, and other things don't. It's almost like we get kind of hoodwinked by some threats that really probably we maybe didn't need to elevate quite where they should be, and others just slip right under the radar, and we just don't kind of, we
like climate change.
Although maybe there's, I think we've got a bit more agency in that, I think, than maybe we've all told ourselves over the years.
I often find myself thinking I'm thinking about the world, like thinking I'm reasoning, but actually just acting like a sort of neurologically upset bag of water, just kind of freaking out at stuff. Are we sort of completely in control of our thoughts and our brains, or what?
Yeah, I think we're surprisingly not in lots of ways, as in we are quite captive to the kind of, we can call them different things, whether we call them sort of biases or heuristics, or just kind of semi-automatic sort of responses and reactions to things that trigger us. And we can know, I think in a sense, like, that you can learn a lot about our minds, and obviously there's now several decades, best part of a century in a way, of sort of understanding about that through psychology, through neuroscience, through other disciplines. But then I guess there's a separate question of, like, you can understand it and it's useful for all sorts of reasons, like, designing better therapy for people, or understanding how children's brains develop. That's all obviously really critical. But does it give you that kind of ability to rise above your neural processes and your thinking processes, and act in a different way? Well, it's actually quite hard to do that. I think actually it's quite hard to step outside of the responses that you see in others, that you see in yourself, but nonetheless you can't help but kind of repeat and to walk through. I'd like lots of people coming into the climate discourse, when they first do, you kind of have this righteous indignation. Why don't people get it? Why
they've seen the graphs, haven't they? Why aren't they upset? Look at this graph. Look at that dead polar bear. Get more upset.
They've seen the graphs. They've seen the dead polar bear. They've read my sign that says "Act now." What's missing? It's no problem.
Well, they must be bastards. Is the only possible other conclusion is they're a bastard.
They could be bastards that disagree with you as well. Like that's critical. So there's this kind of instinctive reaction to think, come on, why don't you get it? I get it. Why don't you get it? But I think from that point, it's been a big old kind of curve away, a big old pivot away from that sort of almost quite didactic starting point, where you say, how do I convince the wrong people that they to understand that they're wrong and to agree with me, and to more just to kind of see that we live in this sort of values soup that you need to navigate your way through, and that kind of more forced sense of proving, debunking, challenging factually people's beliefs is not a waste of time, but it's often, I think, slightly positioned at the wrong level for really why people think the things that they do in the first place.
Wow, values soup. What's in my values soup? What do you mean? So like the stuff that I kind of hold dear, but then all the other stuff that's sort of operating on me in society and that sort of things. What's in your values
what's in
soup?
my values soup? I mean, I think we can all ask that of ourselves, and you can say, what are the guiding sort of principles in your life? That's one definition of a value, and it's really just kind of different ways of sort of carving up the space that we exist in, that says not just what do we think, but a kind of layer beneath that, like what are the things that we really deeply care about, the principles that sort of drive and guide our lives. So it might be, it could be fairness and injustice or equality, or it could be like a sense of kind of security and control, and how do they then lead to or underpin like the risk judgments that we make about a whole suite of different things, including climate change.
And what about COVID then? How does COVID fit into all that? Because it's been, I've been fascinated to watch the process by which, here in the UK, obviously where I sort of know best, an entire country pretty much went from there is no virus to kind of basically overnight, there's a virus and I'm going to keep away from people I would previously have hugged, and I'm going to give 2 meters distance from everyone. And we've lived with that for a year, and we're more or less coming out of it now, touch wood. But then you saw a thing yesterday, because you tweeted it and I retweeted it, which is like there are 30% of the population, 30-40% are like think that things like when you come back from holiday you should always have to quarantine for 10 days forever should now be a thing. Like some people have now, it felt to me a bit like, all right, there's some people in the country who just always thought that sort of stuff. But it feels like maybe our perception of risk has been kind of broken by COVID. But yeah, where have you must have been following all of this and thinking about what it tells us about risk, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that you've put it, that it's been that our risk radar has been kind of broken by it is exactly right. I think we've done a lot of. I mean, we can see in a sense we can see instinctively like the components of this. There was an unprecedented all channel surround sound kind of comms campaign from government and media, yes, but also from ourselves. Like, this came through social media as much as it came through anything else. And a lot of those messages were strongly fear-based and emotive. So it was like, we've been hitting our kind of like the booster button on our risk perceptions pretty hard for quite a long time. And I think we can see again, that it's likely, although I think it's not necessarily true. We don't know the counterfactual where we had a kind of calmer discourse and we still did the behavior change stuff. Is that possible? We don't know. But certainly the argument is always like we needed to kind of scare the shit out of everyone to get everyone to stay at home, and that was worth it in the end. I mean, it's obviously had a kind of knock-on effect, which again sort of well understood from like anxiety and mental health problems that a lot of people have faced over this time. I would say, including I've really felt that myself. I've experienced, my brain has been different over the last year in a way that I didn't expect to happen. But I think, there's been this kind of overreach in terms of it's like we've kind of saturated our risk perception system somehow. We've kind of fed it like risk catnip all year. And now we're just kind of like buzzing and wild and kind of like stop anything, stop everything. That's what that's what those survey responses suggest, is that there's this kind of hangover from it it's going to take a bit of time to undo. I mean, that's where I think that, rather than just kind of whinge about people being cross because the clubs should stay shut forever, I think really, in the same way that there was this coordinated campaign coming into COVID, which worked, certainly in the sense of like the near-term reaction it was intended to have, it feels like we need something of a similar magnitude to guide ourselves out of it again, and I know it's not over, but as the risks change, basically, our perceptions of the risk need to change, but that means the construction of the risk needs to change. And I think that isn't happening at the moment in a clear way that would give us those different cues, those different signals. But I mean, the restrictions are ending, and that is a big signal in itself. There was another bit of research out just this week as well. It was Lorraine Whitmarsh and colleagues, which was basically showing that people weren't really basing their risk judgments on like a sort of visceral sense of, oh, I'm going to get this virus and I'm scared for myself. It was more about the cue that was provided by the lockdown itself, and sort of going, well, if they're doing this, it must be really serious. And again, like compare and contrast of climate change.
Right. So because government is freaking out about something, that in itself made people think a thing is risky. And then now, when the government is going, that's all right now, you can chill out a bit, or whatever they're saying. They're not quite saying that, but that in itself is making people think it's not risky.
Yeah, and so I think that's a good example of where, rather than just kind of back away, rather than to kind of characterize it like scream and shout terror in our faces for a long time and then just kind of go and like drift off, and let everything go back. Because that leaves some people going, well, it's done, which is not true. And it leaves other people, I think, kind of stuck somehow in a pattern of being like, but shouldn't we be, and just kind of feeling scared, even though the risks are actually changing. But I think that's not an argument for kind of being like, idiots, why do you think this? It just completely uncovers something that I think is there all the time, and we know it's there, but it's just really made it explicit that the risks themselves, like I was a bit tentative in saying this, but I would say like most, from the numbers that have had COVID and have been ill from COVID, most of us still haven't had like very direct experience of it. Like we might have had, our phones pinged or someone we know has had it, but it's not like your own house on fire when you're, running out the door. We haven't had that direct experience. It has always mostly been mediated, not for everyone, of course, but for most people. So the construction really matters, and the construction's got to be done responsibly. I think that's the thing. I guess I think some people really sort of looked at the COVID response and were like, we'll have a bit of that for climate change, please. Bit of this, please. That'll get us going. But I don't know. I'm a bit more dubious about that.
Your brain on climate.
Right, so good. That is a good bridge to talk about climate change. Because, particularly at the start of the pandemic, and I think I heard a bit less about this since, there was a load of people that said, I see the government can make something an emergency when it wants to. Well, can we have a bit of that for climate change, please? And it always seemed like that doesn't quite work, because, climate change is an emergency, but it's not like an emergency in the way that your hospitals are all going to fall over tomorrow is an emergency, right? And so, having lived through the last 18 months, do you think that we could take as sort of some lessons from COVID for climate change? Or is it just a different thing? And if it is a different thing, how do you make that sort of concept of the real risk of something like climate change cut through in the way that COVID did?
I mean, being completely honest, like one of the emotions that I experienced at the beginning of the pandemic was, well, firstly, I was really worried that it was gonna, as well as the impact it would have in and of itself, that it would knock climate change off the top of the priority list again. And we just can't afford it. We cannot afford it. It has to be there. We were sort of at the starting line, I feel like, with climate change now, where we're all geared up and going for net zero. And, we've kind of done a lot of the big picture stuff, but now with kind of all the hard work to do, and we just can't afford it. That didn't happen, which I think was gratifying and important. Said something important about where climate as an issue has got to in our world, in our society. But I also felt like somehow a sort of not, yeah, like almost a sense of jealousy about how this risk was being treated so importantly when climate change hadn't been given that treatment. You know, we've worked on this stuff for so long, and we've all spent so much time trying to persuade people to take it seriously. And I almost felt a bit of a sense of like, how can we be rightly so focused on this risk but not apply that consistently to other risks? And I kind of use climate change as a stand-in for like, could be air pollution, could be other kind of systemic environmental issues. It's the same pattern. Yeah. And I mean, like you say, right, they are actually different. So for all this waffling on about construction of risk, like risks are different kind of objectively, if we can use that word. You know, they have different risk signatures. They are experienced even without all the construction in very different ways, have different effects. But I think there are lots of things that we can map onto climate change, and lots of them were sort of being said already, but I think it's kind of proved them in real time, you know, like, so a lot of the stuff that was effective around COVID communication, you know, it very quickly did become humanized. It was very strongly like human narratives. This wasn't just abstract target-based data and kind of climate wonk, climate policy stuff, COVID wonk, COVID policy. That stuff's there, the graphs are there, but, you know, like Guardian's kind of Lost to the Virus series, you know, talking about real lives or whatever it would be. And I think, yeah, like, you know, the COVID communication in lots of ways went with the grain of our instinctive sort of reactions to risk. I would argue like it somehow went a bit too far with the grain, because I think it's left a lot of people in a strange place. And I don't think that would be a good, I don't want that discourse for climate change. I don't wish we had this hyper individualized in some ways, you know, hyper white hot moralized sort of like discourse around, at the moment it's masks again, because they're talking, you know, because they're going to be dropped.
You want something that feels a bit more kind of positive and communal, is it?
Somewhat, yeah, somewhere in the middle of like the sort of distant inertia that we've kind of like shrouded climate change in. And this is where I do think I've changed my mind a bit. Like I think I've definitely written the sentence or variations on it, you know, several times, of kind of like, climate is a difficult risk for us to perceive. It's this perfect storm of, you know, it's distant, it's abstract, it's distributed in time and space. It's not happening to you. Obviously, saying that sat in my cozy house in Bristol, has been happening to a lot of people already around the world for a long time. But persuading the British public, you know, for a long time, I felt like that was one of my go-to lines. You know, like, come on, it is hard for us. This is a hard risk. It's a challenging one. And now, I guess one thing that COVID showed is like, wow, we really can act. Actually, we can do pretty much whatever we like if we decide we want to. That's and right? And I think that, so yes, climate is a difficult risk to perceive, but I think we've also actively constructed it, and that we've got some agency over that in a way that's kept it distant, you know, and has kept it abstract. And I think a lot of the stuff that, you know, Climate Outreach as an organization has done over the years, the wider climate communication field, is sort of saying like, look, let's get away from, you know, debunking the facts and the myths and sort of, you know, arguing the science, or let's get beyond that. Let's connect with telling stories that, you know, engage diverse values, that focus on social norms and humanize the imagery, the language that we use to talk about the issue. Let's repeat those stories. Yeah, you know, let's draw on all these things that's exactly what you've seen has been working with COVID. And it kind of happened almost instinctively, you know, like suddenly those social norms were there and they were real. I mean, you know, a lot, although there were laws passed, a lot of what held it in place was social kind of positive and negative judgment and sort of, you know, sense of doing the right thing. So we have to kind of construct. We have to do a better job of constructing climate, I think, in a different way. Not exactly like COVID, not at all. But I feel like somehow we've sort of almost just accepted that it is hard, and that as a risk, it's a challenge for us to get our heads around. And I don't know, I'm feeling less persuaded by that now.
Talk to me a bit about pain. I don't mean the thing that happens when you stub your toe, although that's very painful. This is Daniel Gilbert's thing, right? So the idea. Oh, tell me what pain is. What's pain? What does pain mean to you?
Right. Yeah. pain in your brain. It's kind of like a risk that is personal to you. You know, that is kind of abrupt. So it happens, not gradually. There's a kind of immorality to it, like a kind of disgust, or like, this is wrong. That's the I, and then it's happening now, right now. That's the end, at the end of pain.
An acronym.
Yeah, PAIN, personal, abrupt, immoral. Now, and I guess, and I have been thinking about this a bit, because we've been having this conversation.
Just say what that is. That was psychologist Daniel Gilbert, who said that like, for us to take a threat kind of seriously now, it needs to meet those criteria. You can't sort of make that up. Like, we have to think that it's happening now to me, that I'm somehow kind of motivated and disgusted by it, and that it's different enough for me to pay attention, right? So, and this is the reason for sort of saying that, is that, like, you can't just make an issue tick those boxes. They have, you know, you can't just say, oh, well, climate change is like that if people don't feel it like that, right?
Yes and no. And I think you can't just say something's an emergency when it doesn't feel like an emergency, is another way of, you know, expressing that. And I think that's true. Yeah, you can't, if someone doesn't believe that a threat is personal, or that is, I mean, abrupt, we're being a bit trapped by the acronym. Abrupt could also be kind of urgent, basically, you know, or if someone doesn't believe that there's not a strong moral dimension to it, a right and wrongness. But that belief can be changed, right? Like, and I think that's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what all of our communications and engagement work needs to be about, because there's nothing about that, whether or not things are perceived as personal, is not, you can't, there isn't like a calculus that you can read that off and says, okay, well, that risk is and that risk isn't. It's constructed to be personal or not, I think, in lots of ways, apart from those very extreme conditions where your house is on fire, your monkey lizard is waking up in the middle of the night, etc. And this is where I think, you know, the recent move and sort of pivot and turn towards taking public citizen engagement, deliberation around climate change. What does this mean for us, for me, in the now, in the near term? It's physically picking up a risk that used to be technocratic and target-based and distant and abstract and talked about in that way and kept in that territory in lots of ways. You know, campaigners have been doing their best, but collectively we've kept climate change in that box, I think, in lots of ways. It doesn't, yes, it naturally wants to be in that box, we could say, as a kind of risk, but we've also helped it to stay there. I think as we bring it closer to us, and you listen to the folks that have been in, say, the Citizens' Assembly, and you hear them talk about how their perception of the risk has changed, and now suddenly, I don't wish pain. I wish pain on all the Citizens' Assembly people, but suddenly they are ticking those boxes. They're like, no, this is happening now. I can see it. I just didn't realize. You know, I can see how this relates to what's happening in the next 20 years. I can understand the kind of the shape and the substance of it. So I don't know. I feel like that's what I feel like, is that we can't just sort of accept that climate change is the wrong kind of risk for us to get on with. Like, I think we can do a much better job at reconstructing it in a way that works with the grain rather than against the grain of our brains.
And that makes me think a bit about, like, again, what links the pandemic to what you were just saying there about having different sorts of conversations in which we kind of think in different ways about whether this stuff matters to me, is the extent to which how much I consider something to be risky or not is determined by, this is me personally, right, talking here, my brain. I'm really influenced by what other people around me say, particularly people that I trust, right? So when all my friends and family are freaking out about a thing, I'm much more likely to freak out about that thing. And how much of sort of why climate change is not taken seriously is because, at least historically, it wasn't something that we really talked about. Like, it was quite rare that you would get just standing in a queue for the post office and the bloke in front of you goes, yeah, I'm quite worried about climate change. Is that changing? And if it is simply talking about it to people, does that in itself start to change how people perceive the risk of something, do you think?
I think it absolutely does, especially when we're dealing with a risk that has it naturally its characteristics for us in a country like the UK in a well-off position. It naturally has the characteristics that keep it at a distance. Then you need to sort of, it's almost like we've sort of been starved of those like raw ingredients that we need to start picking up that risk and running with it a bit. Like, it's just like you say, you don't hear it around you. There's a sort of what used to be a social sort of silence that is not the case anymore. That's changed, and now you can have conversations that are it's become part of our national conversation, which it wasn't for a long time. COVID, for obvious reasons, went sort of straight in at the top of the charts of the national conversation for the last year. And that I think strongly the perception of what other people think is a really critically underused element of like how we understand the world. For climate change, I think a lot of communication and campaigns has been focused on, how do we kind of create some kind of campaign or intervention or project that will raise the awareness or concern about this issue in people's individual minds. But I think, there's quite a few studies, and I think there's loads more to do with this, that have shown that people really like consistently underestimate the level of support for climate policies by others. So everyone's thinking no one else cares about it. Everyone's thinking everyone's more skeptical than they are. Everyone's thinking they support wind power, whatever it would be, less than they actually do. And so it's not about, again, I really don't believe that's about kind of coming in and being like, let's debunk that misperception. But it is about providing spaces where people can see that that's not the case. And I think then where you've got that, that much more richly embedded sense that other people like me care about this is something that we've all got in our sights. We can take this on, and this is what it looks like. That's a very, very different conversation to what was there, like, even 5 years ago, but definitely 10 years ago. And that hasn't happened with COVID because it all happened in such a rush. But I think there's an argument that's exactly what is needed now, because we're coming into a bit more of a slowing down pace now with it in this country, by the looks of it, where it's going to be a case of negotiation and navigating a risk territory. And in that circumstance, the kind of conversation aspect to it is everything, really, and the more you can get away from the sort of the Twitter shouting at each other about the different policy choices, probably the better for us all.
So wrapping this all up a bit then. So people have listened to this and they've gone, right, good, okay, that Adam's clever, I get this stuff now. What are the sort of takeaway couple of things? If you're out there and you're worried about climate change, and you're worried, as you were describing, you're worried that other people are just bastards and not getting it enough. So what are the things you think people should keep in their heads and maybe try and do to help their brains deal with this in the future?
I mean, I think where I've landed with experiencing the last year, like we all have, but I guess experiencing it with a slightly weird niche lens on thinking about how do those risk perceptions relate to climate risk perceptions and the things that we've done as climate communicators and what's happened in real time in front of our eyes with this construction of an emergency in front of us. And I would say I don't wish a kind of for a copy and paste of the COVID risk discourse into climate change. One, because they're so different issues; they really are different, as well as us constructing them in a different way. But two, because there's going to be a constant process of negotiating climate change from here on for decades, and we can't possibly sustain a diet of kind of terror and fear and apocalypse on climate change, even though it warrants it. Like the risks are just as serious and more significant objectively overall, and across time. But what can we see and what can we take that's positive? I think the principles and the ideas that a lot of people have been pushing on for, I guess, moving climate change away from being a sort of a science policy issue and into being a fully enmeshed sort of part of our day-to-day and forward-facing kind of societal decisions is that we can really see that when you connect with people emotionally, when you show relatable human stories, when the government act as if they are taking the risk seriously and give you that clear cue to back up the rhetoric, when you hear the people around you talking in a way that shows their concern, that in a positive way shows their concern, and in a sort of less positive way makes you think, maybe I better not be so sneaky and rinse another 10 flights to Australia or whatever it would be, the equivalent would be for climate change. When all those things come together, you can see just how risks are constructed, and it's not. I think it's only repeating and passing on what I think a lot of risk studies have shown over the years in lots of different ways. What they all amount to really is that there is a danger there that we all kind of react to, but we've got some choices about how we construct risks, and I think we can do a better job of constructing climate change.
So that was my chat with Adam. So why isn't climate change taken like an emergency by government? And something Adam really brought home is that in our complex world, pretty much every big or little risk that we face has got just so much other stuff layered on top of it in terms of how we take it seriously and the people in charge take it seriously. Like who we believe, what those people think, who we listen to, who has the power, what our politics are, how risky stuff is to me personally, what's the immediate jeopardy. And there's no getting around that climate is complex or that governments don't do stuff unless they think it's important. And I guess like all of us, they don't think it's important unless it really actually bloody is right here and now. The pain stuff we talked about is really interesting on that. Or they're being made to because someone, the public, the person next door to you is demanding it. And of course we're all a bit like that. We're biased towards getting on with stuff in the here and now, and it takes a lot to disrupt us and make us think things are risky. Somehow that's got to change. But I do think that Adam is right, that maybe we overthink it. Maybe it's too easy to say climate is that complex. Because actually I remember Boris coming on the telly in March 2020 here in the UK and announcing we were all going to lock down and life was going to be different. I remember that sort of sick and strange, uncanny feeling of upending and of a genuine fear that I felt. I was genuinely scared. And I was scared not at that point particularly because of the virus itself, which still seemed like a kind of abstract thing, but because of how other people were behaving, how Boris was behaving, and how I thought other people would behave from that point on. And I am really influenced by what other people think. I'd love to be one of those amazing, fearsome, independent-minded souls. I'm really not. And everyone did start to act weird. And Boris was acting weird, even for him, so people started acting even weirder. And things changed every day, and the government did stuff with policy and with money to make it clear that this was serious, and people's behaviour changed pretty much overnight, and everyone really fast saw this as a massive risk. Most people anyway. And so what would happen if a government, this government, any government, said, no, the climate emergency is an emergency, and because of that we're going to do some actual emergency things about it. And we're going to spend billions of pounds, and we're going to make the moral case as emphatically as the scientific case, and there's going to be briefings every day on the telly about the latest science. And would that in itself create the permission that government needs to do even more and go even faster in society? I can't help feeling that it might. So thanks massively to Adam for coming on. Adam is at AJ Corner on Twitter, or you can check out his website at adamcorner.uk. This was the first episode. I want to know what you think. Thank you so much for listening this far. You can find the podcast on Twitter at Brain Climate. Leave a comment on there. You can leave a review in your podcast medium of choice, or you can email hello@yourbrainonclimate.com. Please tell people and spread the word. And I'll be back a bit later in the summer with a series of these. I'm aiming for 6 episodes, each week chatting to a different expert. Yeah, perhaps people with PhDs in psychology, but maybe other people who've thought a lot about brains and how they work. And what we'll do is we together will look at the climate crisis through the thing they know about. Thank you so much for listening. Until the show starts properly, look after yourself, hit subscribe, and I'll be back before you know it.